K2 isn't just another mountain. It's the ultimate test of survival. Standing at a brutal 8,611 meters, it's the second highest peak in the world, but it's deadlier than Everest by a long shot. Climbers call it the Savage Mountain for a reason. Unpredictable weather, steep ascents, and zero room for mistakes. Over the years, many elite mountaineers have tried to conquer it, but not all have made it back. Some of the deaths on K2 have been so tragic, so chilling, that they've become legends in mountaineering history. From freak storms to fatal falls, these are the 5 worst deaths on K2. Stories that remind us why this mountain remains one of the most dangerous places on Earth. K2 has never been kind to those who dare to challenge it. It's an unforgiving monster, swallowing even the most experienced climbers whole. But the summer of 1986 was something else entirely. A season so cursed, so cruel, that it became one of the deadliest in mountaineering history. 13 climbers from multiple expeditions perished on its icy slopes, victims of raging storms, avalanches, and sheer exhaustion. Among them were renowned mountaineers like Alan Rouse, Tadeusz Piotrowski, and Julie Tullis, each of whom met their end in ways that still haunt the climbing world. But what unfolded between August 6th and August 10th is the stuff of nightmares, a fight for survival, where the mountain showed no mercy. British climber Alan Rouse had already defied the odds by attempting K2's treacherous northwest ridge, a route so dangerous that even seasoned climbers backed away. After multiple failed attempts, his team decided to turn back. But Rouse, he wasn't ready to quit. Determined to stand on the summit, he joined forces with an international team: Austrians Alfred Imitzer, Willi Bauer, Hannes Weiser, Kurt Diemberger, Polish climber Dobroslawa Miodowicz-Wolf, and British mountaineer Julie Tullis. They took the more conventional Abruzzi route, knowing full well that the window for success was closing fast. But reaching the summit was only half the battle. The real danger awaited them on the way down. On August 4th, the team made their final push. It was late, far too late, when Diemberger and Tullis reached the top. Night was falling, temperatures were plummeting, and the winds were howling. Their descent turned into a desperate fight against exhaustion, but then disaster struck. Tullis fell. She managed to recover, but it was clear they weren't going to make it back quickly. The others, already drained and starving, struggled to return to Camp 4. Along the way, they found Miodowicz-Wolf collapsed in the snow, barely conscious. They forced her to her feet, urging her to descend, but there was no stopping Diemberger and Tullis. They pushed ahead, determined to summit. It would cost them dearly. By the time everyone made it back to Camp 4, a storm was roaring in. They had no food, no fuel to melt snow, and no hope of a quick escape. Then, one by one, the mountain began to claim them. On the night of August 6th, Tullis succumbed to high-altitude pulmonary edema, her lungs filling with fluid, slowly suffocating her in the thin, freezing air. She became the first fatality of what would soon become a full-scale disaster. For the remaining climbers, the storm was a death sentence. By August 10th, a small break in the weather gave them their only chance to escape, but it was too late for Alan Rouse. The once strong British climber, who had fought so hard to reach the summit, was now slipping in and out of consciousness, moaning in agony. His teammates had no choice but to leave him behind in the tent, knowing he would never wake up. Imitzer and Weiser never made it far. Both collapsed in the snow and never got up again. Miodowicz-Wolf, weakened and disoriented, lost her grip on a fixed rope and fell to her death, vanishing into the abyss below. That left only Bauer and Diemberger, their bodies wrecked by frostbite, barely clinging to life as they stumbled down the mountain. They were the only survivors. When the storm finally cleared, K2 was littered with bodies, a grim reminder of what happens when you gamble with the world's deadliest mountain. The 1986 K2 disaster remains one of the most harrowing tragedies in climbing history, a chilling tale of ambition, survival, and the merciless power of nature. Because on K2, the mountain always has the final say. Alison Hargreaves was no ordinary climber. She had defied the impossible, standing alone on the summit of Mount Everest, without bottled oxygen, without Sherpa support, proving to the world that she could conquer the highest peaks on her own terms. She was fearless, determined and unshaken by the dangers that had claimed so many before her. But in August 1995, on the merciless slopes of K2, she would face a final challenge, one she would not survive. The mountain had already earned its reputation as the deadliest in the world. Its steep, unforgiving ridges had swallowed even the strongest climbers, and yet Hargreaves was undeterred. She had joined an American team in June 1995, determined to take on the 8,611-meter giant. For weeks, they fought their way up the brutal slopes, battered by wind and exhaustion, inching closer to the top. By August 13th, she and the remnants of the American team had reached Camp 4, at an altitude where the human body is slowly dying, where every breath is a struggle. They weren't alone. A Canadian-New Zealand team had also made it to Camp 4, and as they prepared for their final push, they encountered another group, a Spanish team of elite mountaineers. The summit was within reach. Just 12 more hours of climbing, just a little more suffering, and then victory. But the mountain had other plans. Peter Hillary, son of Everest legend Sir Edmund Hillary, stood at Camp 4 and looked up at the sky. Something wasn't right. The weather, which had been eerily calm for the past 4 days, was beginning to shift. The winds whispered a warning, clouds creeping in from the horizon like shadows stalking their prey. Hillary knew what was coming. He had seen this before, on other peaks, in other disasters. The mountain was setting a trap, and yet no one else seemed willing to listen. Hillary turned back, retreating down the mountain, but Allison Hargreaves and 6 others pushed on. The summit was glorious. At 6:45 p.m., Hargreaves and Spanish climber Javier Olivar reached the top, standing on the edge of the world, looking down at the endless, frozen expanse beneath them. One by one, the others followed. American Rob Slater, Spaniards Javier Escartin and Lorenzo Ortiz, and New Zealander Bruce Grant. 6 climbers stood victorious. 6 climbers felt the rush of standing atop one of the world's greatest giants. They didn't know that their time was already up. As they turned to descend, the storm struck. It came like a hammer, crashing into the mountain with the force of 1,000 avalanches. The wind roared, screaming through the ridges, lifting loose ice and snow like daggers in the air. Temperatures plummeted in an instant, freezing flesh to metal, turning breath into ice. The world disappeared into a raging white hell. Visibility was gone, the path home erased in an instant. They were trapped, exhausted, freezing, dying. Far below them, Canadian climber Jeff Lakes had made the decision to turn back before the summit, a choice that had spared him for a while. He somehow staggered down to one of the lower camps, barely alive, his body wrecked by frostbite and exposure. But it was too late. The cold had already claimed him. He would never make it home. Higher up, the storm raged through the night, and the 6 climbers simply vanished. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Karakoram, the mountain was silent. No radio calls, no movement, no signs of life. It wasn't until later that the first chilling clues emerged. 2 Spanish climbers, Pepe Garces and Lorenzo Ortiz, had managed to survive the storm by hunkering down at Camp 4. As they descended, weak from frostbite and exhaustion, they stumbled upon something half buried in the snow. A blood-stained anorak, a climbing boot, a harness. It didn't take them long to realize who they belonged to. Allison Hargreaves was gone. From their vantage point near Camp 3, they saw a lone body, motionless in the distance, half hidden in the ice. They didn't dare approach. The risk was too great, the mountain still too dangerous. But deep down, they knew the wind had taken her. Later, as the news spread, Captain Fawad Khan, a Pakistani army officer who had been working with the expedition, revealed a grim truth. He had pleaded with her, warning her not to go beyond base camp, telling her the weather was turning. "If you climb now, it will be suicidal," he had said. She had gone anyway. For Allison Hargreaves, there was never another choice. The mountains called to her, and she had always answered. She had risked everything to stand on the highest peaks, to prove she could do what others feared. And yet, in the end, K2 had the final word. It did not matter how strong she was. It did not matter how skilled or determined. The mountain does not care. The mountain only takes. August 1st, 2008. A day that would go down in history as one of the darkest moments on K2, the savage mountain that has claimed more lives than almost any other peak on Earth. It started as a day of triumph, a day where dreams were within reach. It ended in horror. The ascent had been brutal, as it always is on K2. The air was thin, every breath a struggle. The death zone, above 8,000 meters, was a place where the human body is slowly shutting down, where survival is measured in mere hours. Yet, against all odds, several international teams were making their final push, inching toward the summit, determined to claim victory over the deadliest mountain in the world. They had made it through the bottleneck, a section so steep and narrow that one wrong step means certain death. But no one knew that high above them, an unseen killer lurked, one that would unleash devastation within moments. At 4:30 p.m., just as climbers were beginning their descent, it happened. A massive serac, an overhanging column of ice, towering like a frozen giant above the mountain, collapsed. Without warning, a cascade of ice and rock thundered down the bottleneck, obliterating everything in its path. In seconds, the fixed ropes, their only lifeline back down, were gone. The climbers were now stranded at over 8,200 meters, trapped in the death zone with no clear way down. Panic set in. The sun was setting. The temperature was dropping. The storm clouds were moving in. There was no time to waste. Some climbers made the desperate decision to descend without ropes, gambling their lives on sheer instinct. Some fell to their deaths within moments. Others, disoriented and exhausted, collapsed in the snow, their bodies freezing in place. One by one, the mountain began to claim them. Some climbers tried to help their fallen teammates, but there was only so much they could do when death was tightening its grip on them too. Italian climber Marco Confortola and Dutch mountaineer Wilco van Rooyen fought their way downward, determined to escape K2's grasp. Van Rooyen became lost for over 36 hours in the death zone, suffering severe frostbite, hallucinating as the thin air and extreme cold began eating away at his mind. Serbian climber Dren Mandis had been among the first to perish. His death triggered a chain reaction of catastrophe, as climbers attempting to assist him were caught in the collapse. Pakistani high-altitude porter Jahan Beg was one of them. He fell to his death, screaming as he disappeared into the abyss. Norwegian climber Rolf Bay, caught in an ice collapse, stood no chance against the mountain's fury. His body was never found. Others held on as long as they could, hoping against hope that rescue would come. But there was no rescue, not this high, not in this storm. For 48 hours, the mountain showed no mercy. A total of 11 climbers from France, Ireland, Norway, Pakistan, South Korea, and Serbia lost their lives. When the storm finally cleared, K2 was silent. The mountain, as always, had taken what it wanted. For the survivors, the descent was a nightmare. They staggered down in a daze, frostbitten, broken, haunted. Some of them barely made it back alive, carried down by sheer willpower. They had conquered the mountain, but at what cost? K2 does not care how strong you are, how experienced, how determined. It does not care how much you dream. It only takes. February 5th, 2021. K2, the savage mountain, had already taken countless lives, but this time it was different. This time, 3 of the world's most experienced climbers had set out to do the impossible, conquer K2 in the dead of winter without supplemental oxygen. It was a challenge so dangerous, so unforgiving, that many believed it was suicide. Yet Ali Sadpara, John Snorri, and Juan Pablo Moore refused to back down. They had spent their lives pushing the limits, staring death in the face and coming out victorious. But K2 does not care about records. It does not care about experience. As they made their way up the mountain, the temperature plunged to minus 60 degrees Celsius. The wind howled like a living beast, threatening to rip them from the mountainside with every step. The air was razor thin, every breath a battle, but they pushed forward, determined to etch their names into history. Then, at the bottleneck, K2's deadliest passage, where towering ice seracs loomed like frozen guillotines above them, everything changed. Sajid Sadpara, Ali's son, had been climbing alongside them, but as they neared the death zone, altitude sickness hit him hard. His father urged him to use oxygen from an emergency kit, but when the equipment failed, Sajid had no choice but to turn back. It was the last time he would ever see them alive. Sajid waited at Camp 3, watching the minutes turn into hours, the hours into an endless night. He expected to see their silhouettes emerging from the storm at any moment, but they never came. By morning, panic turned to horror. Something had gone terribly wrong. His father, his hero, was missing. A desperate search was launched. Helicopters flew to 7,000 meters, scanning the unforgiving slopes for any sign of life. The mountain was silent. There was no movement, no signal, nothing. As hours turned into days, hope faded. In the death zone, where oxygen is too thin to sustain life, survival was impossible. The world mourned. 3 of the most fearless climbers had vanished, swallowed by the mountain. But Sajid refused to let K2 keep his father's story unfinished. For months, he searched, he climbed, he dug, he begged the mountain to return them. Then, in July, as the snow began to thaw, K2 revealed its cruel secret. The bodies of Ali Sadpara, John Snorri, and Juan Pablo Moore were found hanging lifelessly by their safety ropes near the bottleneck. They had come so close, so close. There was no way to bring them down, no way to give them the burial they deserved. Instead, they were laid to rest in the ice, forever a part of the mountain they had fought so hard to conquer. Ali Sadpara's legacy would not end there. His name would be spoken with reverence by climbers across the world. His son would continue his journey, carrying forward his father's spirit. But K2 had won again, because in the end, no one conquers Savage Mountain. It only allows you to leave, if it chooses. July 27, 2023. K2, the Savage Mountain, was once again demanding blood. As the world watched, history was being made. Norwegian mountaineer Kristen Harila was on the brink of setting a record, pushing her limits to become the fastest person to conquer all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks. But while she and others pursued glory, one man lay dying beneath their boots. His name was Mohammed Hassan, a Pakistani high-altitude porter. Unlike the elite climbers chasing records, Hassan was not there for fame. He wasn't a professional alpinist with sponsorship deals or state-of-the-art gear. He was a father, a husband, a man risking his life for a paycheck. Somewhere near the bottleneck, one of the most dangerous sections of K2, Hassan slipped. He tumbled off a precarious ledge, his body smashing against the unforgiving ice. When the snow settled, he was still alive, but barely. For hours, he clung to the edge of death, bleeding and broken. And as he lay there, the climbers kept moving. They stepped over him, they climbed past him. They continued their march to the summit, chasing records while a man fought for his last breath below. Footage later emerged. Shocking, damning. A group of climbers walking by his motionless body, their crampons crunching through the ice as they focused on their ascent. The images, captured by a drone, sparked outrage across the world. 2 Austrian climbers, Philipp Blamig and Wilhelm Steindl, who had abandoned their own summit bid due to dangerous conditions, later reviewed the footage. What they saw sickened them. "We saw a guy alive, lying in the traverse in the bottleneck, and people were stepping over him. There was no rescue mission." Steindl broke down in tears. Had the hunger for glory really outweighed human life? In the face of mounting criticism, Kristen Harila defended herself. She insisted that she and her team had tried to help, but the terrain was treacherous, the altitude merciless. It was impossible, she claimed, to bring him down. "He was not part of our team," she explained. "I didn't see him fall, but once we realized he was hurt, he was never left alone." The world, however, was not convinced. Questions burned through the mountaineering community. Had Hassan been abandoned? Did his life matter less because he was just a porter? Had ambition turned deadly? In the end, Hassan's fate was sealed the moment he slipped. He died where he fell, his body swallowed by the ice, another sacrifice to the deadliest mountain on Earth. The climbers? They reached the summit. The records were set, but K2 had left the world with a bitter truth. How much is a human life worth when glory is within reach?